Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Wednesday, November the 6th. Trust you guys are waking up, feeling refreshed and ready to go. Um, I, uh, I don't know about you, but yesterday I stayed up a little bit too late watching the election results. So we'll have to find some time in the course of today, maybe to go to bed a little bit earlier. But yep, it looks like we have a new president, and it's uh, it's good to know that there's going to be no more robocalls, no more ads on the television. Yeah, all that stuff is behind us. So we should have a day just to celebrate the lack of constant media. How's that? Well, we are in the midst of a new series, but we realize that even in the studies that we're looking at, there's always this interaction, right, between man's desires and the way in which God directs steps. And for that, we should be thankful because we know the one who holds the future, and all of one's hands are in His. On Sunday, this past Sunday, I told everyone, regardless of what happened this past week, that God was still going to be on the throne on Wednesday, and so He is today. But I'm glad to have all of that behind us now, and just looking to hopefully a better future. Well, we were in this study in Casket Empty, and this has been week 6, and we are in a portion where we are talking about Sinai, and in particular, God's rescue and how God reveals. And this week, today, what I'd like to do is just take you through a little bit of Exodus chapter 19 to 20. And this is a very pivotal point in our story, and so I'd like to bring that up with you. I left us yesterday, um, hopefully, with leaving you with this one thought regarding Moses and his early beginnings. It appears for Moses that in his first 40 years, and by the way, a really good synopsis of the history that you find in the early chapters of Exodus could be found in Acts chapter 7. If you were to read Acts chapter 7, um, the uh, the martyr Stephen gives a wonderful, wonderful insight into what has taken place during these days, and I found that to be extremely helpful. So, for instance, if you pick it up um, at verse 23 of Acts 7, it says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other? But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So if you think of where Egypt is, um, yeah, I was looking to see if I had one of my maps with me here this morning. Uh, but if you were to think of where Egypt is, you go down into that Sinai Peninsula, you go all the way up the other side of that Masai Peninsula, and then if you bear to your right, right there is Midian. So Moses went a pretty long way to get away from the clutches of Pharaoh in Egypt. Because it appears when you read in Exodus that Moses was now under the threat of Pharaoh, who was looking to kill him because of this murderous act. You know, it's another interesting thing here about what what we find here in the storyline in Acts chapter 7 is that Stephen here writes that in verse 25, he says, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. So that's given you a little bit of insight too into Moses's personality. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but here in verse 25, it seems to plant the seed that maybe Moses thought that because he was Pharaoh's son, because he had all this education, that people would, defer to him, and that somehow or another he was going to lead the people forward. It's interesting that this very thing is going to happen, but not for another 80 years. It appears that God has to teach Moses some lessons first. Maybe one being that of humility, because now Moses flees to Midian, and it says that while he's there, he's tending sheep, right? But those 40 years will pass. And one day an angel is going to appear to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. And when he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. So as he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. And then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then God begins to tell him how not only is he remembering God's covenant, but he hears the cries of the Israelites who are being oppressed by Egypt, an oppression that will last for almost 430 years. Only now, in verse in the text, we find that Moses was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself. God is the one now who, after 40 years, brings Moses back, and now he raises him up to be this deliverer. For 40 more years, Moses is going to have the experience of leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, and then what was thought was going to be entering into this promised land, but we're going to find that later in our story, it doesn't quite work out the way they thought, right? But what I want you to think of for the remainder of this morning is if you look in Exodus chapter 19, I want you to look at verse 19 and pick it up at verse 3. In Exodus 19, verse 3, it says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. So this now is at a time when all of the all of those events surrounding their deliverance, all those mighty signs and acts of power that God did to bring Israel out of Egypt, all of this has taken place, right? All of the plagues, all of those signs, the great Passover, where God rescues Israel and the firstborn of families pass. Yeah, there is all of this that takes place. Moses carries them out. They cross the Red Sea in miraculous fashion, and now they are camped near this mountain and Mount Sinai. And God calls Moses aside, and he says, I have something that I want to say to the house of Jacob, and I have something that I want you to say to the people of Israel. And then it says this in verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings. and brought you to myself. So God is the one who had superintended this whole process. God was there and remembering the promise that he made to the promise that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he says, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant. So what covenant is that? The covenant that we have been, speaking about for a number of weeks now is this Abrahamic covenant, a covenant that God made with Abraham to give him descendants more numerous than the stars of the sky, that God promised to give him land, this promised land, and that God would maintain this covenant so that they would be then a blessing to the nations of the world. So God would bless them so that they would be a blessing. And God says, I'm going to do this as an everlasting covenant. So it's going to be in effect for you, Abraham, and to your son, Isaac, and to his son, Jacob, and to Jacob's sons as this begins to unfold. But verse 5 is speaking about a different covenant now. He says, now if you will fully obey me and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will what? Be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So all of this now, God is about to enter into a bilateral covenant with Israel. Before, it was all what God was going to do in and through Abraham. But now, one of the things that you really need to pay attention to here is that this covenant is going to be a bilateral covenant. It's going to require us to do our part, much the same way God had approached Adam and Eve. Right? I want you to subdue the land. I want you to rule over all of the living creatures that I have placed. I want you to be fruitful and multiply, but you cannot eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is in the middle of this garden. So there was all this blessing, and there was this one prohibition, and it didn't work out so well for Adam and Eve, did it? And consequently, for all of humanity, they lost paradise. And now God is seeking a way to bring men and women back into this fellowship that he had with himself. And so here now God is about to raise up Moses. He's going to be he is this leader now. God brings him to Mount Sinai, and he is going to speak of a covenant that he's going to have with the people so that moving forward, they would be blessed, that they would recognize that they stand in a unique position with God, that out of all the nations, God is calling them as a nation to himself. They are going to be his treasured possession. And what are they going to be? They're going to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. In other words, a people that have been set apart for him. One way I like to explain this is I said, he's using Israel now as a trophy of his grace. He's showing Israel to the world and saying, look, this is what happens when people walk with me, when they follow in my steps. I'm here to bring them life, for them to experience this in its abundance. And that promise is going to be open to all the other nations of the world too. It isn't just like, well, I love Israel more than everybody else. No, he's saying here, you're going to be for me like a kingdom of priests. And what does a priest do? But ministers to others, right? Who speaks to God's word to them. This is going to be a holy nation of people who respond. And as people will see how they walk, they're going to want a piece of that. And this is the way in which God is going to fulfill that promise that he made to Abraham, that he would be that he would bless the nations of the world. So now that God is saying, listen, okay, this is a special time that's coming, because now I'm not just blessing, your forefathers. Now I'm going to bless this entire nation. I'm going to call you into a nation, a people. And that's exactly what Moses is doing here. So look at verse 7 and 8. Verse 7 and 8 says, so Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people, set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. And this position where people are going to listen, they're going to put into practice what God is about to share with them, is where we now come into our story of the 10 commandments, known also as the 10 words, right? So God spoke all these words to them. And this is now these 10 commandments. And what I want you to see in these 10 commandments is how God is going to use them to form this community. So this nation that is being brought together, right? The peoples of Jacob, his 12 sons, and now all of their sons and daughters, and how this kingdom has begun to expand so much over these many centuries now, that they are a numerous people. And yet they're going to be governed by God's word, and it will bring a flourishing to their community, but it's also going to set them up to be a testimony to the nations around them. So what's one of the first things? One of the first things here is that God says to them, I am the Lord, your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. It's like he said in verse 19, right? He says, I lifted you up, right? I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So God rescued them out of this out of the slavery that they were experiencing in Egypt. And now God is about to speak to them. But God lets them know. He says, I'm the God who did that. When he says, I am the Lord your God, the words there are Yahweh Elohim. It's the same words that are used in Genesis when God speaks of himself as the creator God. God is about to recreate for them a future. He has begun by delivering them out of Egypt. And what he's saying to them is, there are no rivals, not even Pharaoh. You've seen what I've done to Pharaoh. And so now that he has their attention, he says to them, you shall have no other gods before me. This command now, one of the things that can escape our attention is this isn't the plural you, like you all, right? This is a you that's singular. But God's speaking to everyone, right? But what he is doing is he's speaking to the whole group, but to each one in particular, which I think is interesting, because then you and I now, we recognize that I can be a part of a community of people who love God, but I am also I also have the responsibility to walk with God myself. I am responsible for making those decisions to walk in his way, to put into practice his truth. At Bethany, that's our definition of a disciple. A disciple is someone who loves God and loves others by putting his truth into practice. And otherwise, how is it that you really are going to show that you love God if you're not doing the things that He's calling you to? So here, when God presents Himself to them and says, "You shall have no other gods before me," the "you" is addressed to them individually. And what He's saying is, there are no other gods. All gods are not the same. I've just finished demonstrating that to you, have I not? I have just shown you that out of all of the idol work, out of all the gods that the Egyptians worshipped, I showed myself superior to all of them. It wasn't even a contest. And their very presence on Mount Sinai is a testimony to that. Um, Pharaoh didn't really want them to go. He saw them as slave labor to build up his cities. How are they going to get out underneath the heel of that kind of oppression? They don't have an army. They had no resources. But God comes in, and in the work that God has done, He breaks the back of Pharaoh till the people are just saying, "Listen, you guys got to go." And when they did, they they find themselves now on Mount Sinai, waiting for God to open up the path that is going to be before them. So there's only one who's calling them for their allegiance. And this is the centerpiece of all else that's going to follow. Because if you don't really believe that God is God, then you're going to come up with a substitute. And that substitute can be, our own ambitions, right? We begin to figure out what we think is the right way. And ultimately, isn't that exactly what took place with Adam and Eve in the garden? Don't you see, like, this is just showing us again, it reveals the heart of humanity here. Because God is saying, "Listen, I want you to follow me. I want you now to recognize that there are no other gods before me. But if you leave room in your life so that you're thinking, yeah, maybe, or there might be another way," then when push comes to shove and God is calling you to do things that, or to respond in a way that doesn't seem, that's really what you want to do, you're going to choose your way instead of His. Unless there is this singular devotion in your own life where you recognize that there are no other gods, that He is unique, and He has demonstrated that already. I can't stress this enough, that this first command is really at the hub that's going to keep everything else together. And you're going to see when people do it, it brings life. But when they don't, just like in the garden, it just leads to death. And it's like life ceases to be so filled with joy. The second commandment, flows out of it. It says, "You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." One of the things that you're going to find, right? God says, if we just read this, right? It says, "Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you'll be my treasured possession. You'll be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, right? All of these promises are dependent on them making certain that they don't put any other gods before him. But here it's saying, look, don't make any idols for yourself. In other words, no visible representations. Idols are dead. They're made out of wood and stone, right? They don't speak, they don't smell, they don't walk, they're not alive. Idols are dead, but God is living. He's saying, look, the only legitimate image then is not the wood and stone that we create, not the images that we look to as if they were going to transfer their blessings to us. Now, what God is calling us to here is to in a relationship with him. He says, listen, if he says, if you live this way, then he says, I'm going to show love to you and to your generations for those who love me and keep my commandments. There's a blessing, but you also see there's a judgment in this text too. And this is something now that is revealing something of God's character. Think about it. He's calling to himself a nation now amongst all these people, and of all the things that he could set before them, he recognizes that the idea of counterfeit gods in one's life can begin to crowd him out. And the next thing you know, we can make gods of so many things. There's a great book by Tim Keller called Counterfeit Gods. And he looks out not just at the idols that are created, in primitive cultures, but can we not make an idol of education? Can we not make an idol of beauty? Can we not make an idol of pleasure, of power, right? Of money? And all the while, we may not have that little trinket, but somehow or another, we're following these ambitions, thinking that they're going to give us this full life, where God is saying there is no other life apart from me. If you know me, I will give you this abundant life. But man, we could be in pursuit of so many things, and then at the end still find that it just falls short. That everything we thought it would promise, we're left lacking. No, these two commandments together now, they begin to forge the road ahead, making sure that we have, with clarity and singularity, set our hearts, our minds on the one who gives us life, who directs our steps. But it has to be something that we ourselves are embracing. My friends, this, it's funny that we're talking about this on this day after an election. Some are going to be pretty sad. Others, they're excited. But again, we didn't vote for a savior, did we? We already have one. It's already been predetermined for us that we are to fix our eyes on Jesus and run with endurance this race that's marked out. When we do that, we're going to be a blessing to our neighbors. We're going to experience that blessing for ourselves. That's something worthy of seizing the day. That's telling us every day that God is good all the time. And so our future is all about learning more about him so that we might in turn be these trophies of grace, this treasured possession that God could use to bless all the nations of the world. Is that any different than when he said, you are the light of the world? He says, let your light so shine that men may see your good work and glorify your Father who is in heaven. My friends, we have a secure future. And now here on Mount Sinai, the people are listening from God directly. God is speaking these words, not to Moses, who then is bringing it to the people. But if you read in at the end of 19 and 20 of Exodus, God himself is the one who's doing all the speaking. Well, my friends, we'll pick it up again from here tomorrow, Lord willing. But you go out today, just seize the day. Let these thoughts just, continue to swim around in your head so that they might sink down deeply into your heart. God bless you. Look forward to spending more time again tomorrow. God bless.